Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today, How to Claim an Awakened Psychology with Ragini Michaels. And welcome to you.
Thank you, Duane. It's a pleasure to be here for sure.
So, there's a long history and a lot of credentials for your work. One of the things I thought was interesting is that a lot of people call you the Queen of Paradox from some of your early work, for which you were well known. And you call yourself the global coffee shop hopper because of all the travel you've done and always
Yeah.
found a place to land, right?
Yep. Always found a place to land and always wanted to have a cup of coffee, particularly when I was in Europe. I loved the outside coffee shops.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, let's not spend too much time on history because our listeners and our audience are really curious about what does it mean to have an awakened psychology?
Well, I thought that was an interesting question myself. My background is in behavioral change, which deals a lot with the unconscious process and thus psychology. So at one point in time, I became interested in how people who were able to remain unflappable in the presence of emotional turmoil or inside or outside, how did they do that? How was their psychology different from my ordinary psychology? Because I was not unflappable. Okay. I got upset in the presence of like 90% of life. Okay. So, having had a long background in meditation and contemplation, spiritual inquiry, ashram life, and all of that, I kind of really wanted to be able to be more calm and present to what is happening in the moment. So, I decided to look at the psychology and see if there was any difference. So I did a study of the psychology that had some similarities to it, regardless of whether the person I was looking at was male or female, whether they were alive or dead, whatever their path, spiritual path was, whatever time frame they lived in. There were certain things that were similar, actually not similar, exactly the same, that allowed each of these people to actually demonstrate the ability to stay basically equanimous or centered or balanced in the presence of turmoil, either external or internal. So that's what got me started on the whole thing, because I wasn't the world's best meditator. That was for sure. Like all of us who meditate, the mind goes all over the place, right? And mine's no different. And so I began to think, well, there must be something else going on here. So I looked, and there is definitely some differences. And that's what my work called Paradox Management that you mentioned, and Paradox Mindset has been based on, is those differences in psychology, how you actually look at the world, how you make sense of it, as opposed to just your spiritual path and what it is you're doing to become more mindful and present in your meditations or contemplations.
Interesting, interesting. So, if you claim an awakened psychology, does that change the sense of who you are?
It seems to. The first steps, I think a lot of people are already taking, in that they're working to build their awareness through mindfulness and through learning how to be present to what's in front of them. The harder thing is to be mindful and present of what's inside of us. Okay, that's the harder thing to do, because when we can manage that, it changes how we're relating to what's outside of us. So, yeah, there was definitely a big difference in not just how do you, the key is, how do you take your mindfulness into daily life, right? How does it impact your ability to navigate the challenges and the difficulties and the conundrums that you meet either at work or at home? So I found that your psychology had a lot to do with that, and that there were several basic differences between the ordinary psychology and the awakened psychology. And that's kind of what the whole thing has been focused on, is helping people know what those are, and then how to build up their ability to live from those elements in their psychology.
And that's different, would you say, than the ego? Is there a
Yes,
function there?
it's different than the ego, I think, but I think we have to use the ego and understand that its role is pretty much predominant. It's kind of like the dictator, right? So whatever we do is dictated by the ego. I like to talk about it in this way, that the goal of an awakened psychology is to move your ego into the back seat so that it's no longer behind the steering wheel in your car or whatever it is you're driving. Somebody called our body the other day your Land Rover. So I kind of liked that. So who's ever in charge of driving your Land Rover, your body, mind, we want it to be the tenets of an awakened psychology rather than the one that's kind of asleep and totally driven by the ego. All I really want is pleasure, to be right, to be noticed, to be loved. I don't care about anything else. And let's just get rid of everything else and just go for that, right? So we're aiming at changing that so that you can put your attention someplace else.
Interesting, interesting. So what do you have to do to claim this awakened psychology?
Well, there's a couple of really important things. One, you're going to need a mindfulness or a meditation practice. You're going to need that first and foremost if you want this to actually change your behavior. You can do this totally intellectually, but it won't actually transform you. And so the first thing you really need to do is develop the awareness that meditation, mindfulness practices will help you get. After that, it's, like, what do you do with your attention? Where is your attention placed? And in most mindfulness practices, you are working with your attention. Where do you put it? Okay. Put it on your breath. Do you put it on your body? Do you put it on a mantra? What do you do with it? So in an awakened psychology, there are two things where your attention goes that's primary and above and beyond all other things. Two specific things that I found that were the same in all of the awakened psychologies that I studied. And those were, number one, impermanence was the first one. Their attention was on the reality of impermanence, that everything changes. And then, of course, none of us like that because we want the security of knowing what's coming, right? So impermanence, of course, generates uncertainty because you don't know what's going to come next. And if you don't relate to it in a different way than we're taught to, which is I want to hold on, right, to what I have. And I want that to be the stable baseline of my life, right? And so we don't like change. Essentially, nobody really likes change, although some people do. Some people prefer change over stability, right? Those are the adventurers of our world, the people who go out and they just want to try everything new. So impermanence is the first thing. And I found that in the awakened psychology, impermanence was always invited to sit at the head of the table anytime a decision-making conference was being called by the mind. Okay. Impermanence had a permanent seat at the table and generally at the head of the table. It was the number one thing that was brought into consideration when making decisions. Well, I thought that was interesting. And the second thing that was completely the same in all of the psychologies that I looked at, that I deemed were awakened by my standards or my criteria, was the way they related to duality. And this is where the element of paradox came in, is that consistently across the board, they saw duality as an organic, unified whole. This was not something that had to be strived for to create. It was just the way it was seen. As soon as there was one polarity coming up, like, let's say, happiness, the opposite would come up, sadness. Naturally, the psychology would give you both, and then it would be seen as, oh, this is one whole, right? This is not two separate competing things, and I want happiness, so let's get rid of sadness, right? Which is the ordinary psychology's way of working with that. So the way that they had a different view of duality, and they had an embracing of impermanence as the most important factor to consider. The way they looked at duality helped them deal with impermanence in a way that leads them, I should say, to seeing life more as a unified whole when you're in the presence of conflict. And that's where the paradox comes in, where the mind gets all conflicted, right? That's been your experience. You have a whole chapter in your wonderful book, by the way, on paradox and and where that appears in the corporate world. It was wonderful. I love your book, by the way. It was great.
Thank you. So if more of us saw the whole rather than the separateness, what would that do for the collective, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it would free more people to be able to act from equanimity and balance rather than, I mean, emotional balance rather than from reactivity and polarization. So I think the place where this is really pertinent today is because there's so much polarization. And even those of us that are polarized to what we consider to be the best side of the coin, right? We still have to deal with the other side of the coin because we can't get rid of it. And that's one of the core things that has to be dealt with both neurologically and at the unconscious level of the mind. You have to have a new neural pathway laid into the brain because there isn't one there that we've touched into. We're assuming there's one not there. Mystics, awakened people say it's there. It's you just don't know how to get to it. So we're going to operating presupposition is let's say it's not there. And we're going to work to create it. So my work works on those two levels, which is to help create a new neural pathway that says both of those are okay, and they come together as a unified whole. And then to answer the objections of the unconscious mind that is geared to avoid pain at all costs. And since pain is a part of life, it becomes a challenge, and that's why you have to have some mindfulness and presence developed to even get into this at all.
So in other words, just to be able to be calm and still and so that you can focus differently.
You can focus differently. You have more clarity. And this way you're opening yourself up to another reservoir of clarity, as you say, that taps into a different dimension that we have that we can't get to if we're very polarized. If we only want the happiness and not sorrow, and we devise our life around that, or we only want to succeed and we never want to fail, this presents a problem because that's not the way life actually works. That's like looking at a river flowing through a riverbank and saying, I want that river water to only flow on the left side of the bank. I want it to stop going over to the right side of the bank, right? I mean, it's so obvious when we look at nature that there's a true relaxation into seeing opposites as one whole that operate together. So the goal is to be able to change that, and that changes our ability to live with paradox, uncertainty, change, ambiguity, ambivalence emotionally, if we have a way to get back to the center, which is actually what my actual work is called, centered no matter what. And to get there, we need to work with the brain and the unconscious mind. But first, we have to get the ideas in there. And that's where starting to develop an awakened psychology is really helpful. Does that make sense, Duane?
Makes sense. And to me, there's also this interaction between the physical body.
Mm-hmm.
I can be in my body and not notice what's going on.
Yes, because I'm with you. The body is the number one place we have to go to find out what's going on inside. Yeah, it never lies. I love that about the body. It always tells you exactly where you're tripped up. Contraction, ragged breathing, facial muscles start to contract, or you get paralyzed, you can't move, shoulders come up, your hands start to grip together, your lips purse. I mean, it always tells us that we're in the process of rejecting what is in the moment.
So I'm hearing more than one level, because there's this idea of doing it for myself, for my own balance and movement between whatever's going on, because there's movement, and being able to do it with others. So yes, I can see that it takes practice, doesn't it?
It takes practice. And if you want to do it with others, which you can, you do have to have done it with yourself first. Otherwise, the natural tendency of the ordinary mind is to polarize, is to have chosen one way as the right way. Even in coaching, I noticed that people sometimes are so against offering new information, that they don't offer it. They simply continue to try and guide the person to their own inner knowing, which is totally what you're supposed to do. And yet there's a time where people don't have any experience at all of what it is, a new dimension, a new level that you're trying to bring in. And that's where it can be very helpful, for example, to offer some re-education, so to speak. It's a fine line, but in the coaching world, between holding someone accountable versus also guiding them to new information, it's kind of a dance between the two things, So I think it's always a dance between polar opposites, no matter what we're talking about, inside and outside. When you're outside, I think the best thing I've discovered is do inside first and then do outside. Okay.
I'm just thinking about the different domains of things like religion and politics and on and on and on and on, where people have already taken a position, if you will.
Right. Right.
And so the movement between that is a pathway if people choose it.
It's there if we choose it. Excuse me. Most of us don't realize we can make it. We have a choice. And that's because of the way our brain is operating. Our brain only gives us two options when we interface with reality or with the environment. You either have to go towards what's there or away from what's there. That's it. That's for the physical level. So what we're trying to do now in my work is offer a new option for the emotional, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of our being, because the body will never go for both. It won't, because it's like dangerous as far as the body's concerned. You have to survive. It's like the prime directive of physical survival, right? But when you get to emotional, psychological, and spiritual, it's kind of like really not useful. It's not useful because it generates more stress, more emotional stress, because you can't do it. You can't get rid of negative emotions. You can't get rid of negative thoughts. You can't get rid of the dynamic between material and spiritual. You must learn how to become bigger than that polarity so that you can embrace it. So that has a lot to do with awareness, with where you place your attention. And in an awakened psychology, the attention is focused on primarily impermanence and duality, the wholeness of things, as your first go-to. Okay. So my work is really about how do you get your brain to follow that, and how do you get your unconscious mind to say, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'll let you do that.
What just popped in my mind was, someone always says the glass is half full or half empty. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I had this realization that, I just need a bigger glass.
Yeah. There you go.
More capacity, right? Just more
Absolutely.
Capacity.
You can increase your capacity, and as you do it enough, you start to see that you can't have a glass half full without also having a glass half empty. You cannot separate the two. You cannot, just like you can't separate night and day. You cannot do it. You can't separate the inside from the outside. There are certain things in life we just have to make our peace with. And the awakened psychology gives us a real inroad to being able to start learning how to do that by placing our attention, not just on our breath, which is fabulous and has to be there. So I'm totally for all mindfulness practices, right? But then the next step, if you really want to go further with it, is to start placing your attention, your awareness and your attention on impermanence and how it permeates every day, everything. And your response to that, which is, I don't like that. I don't know if you ever had like an ice cream cone and you're just so sad because you're down to the last bite, right? You don't want it to end, right? And it's so sad because there it is, it's going to be gone in a second. And, you make your peace with it. And then the thing to notice is within probably 5 minutes, your mind is off looking for the next piece of pleasure. Right? And your awareness and placing your attention on impermanence and on the wholeness of opposites, which first means you have to be aware of opposites, which most people are not. We don't think in terms of polarities. So the first step is starting to learn how to think in terms of polarities. And I think we have a PDF that people can get from me afterwards called The Inner Tug of War, which will help you identify like a bunch of polar opposites in your daily life that you can start to notice how you say, I want this one and not that one. Right. I want to be happy, not sad. I want to be rich, not poor. I want to be healthy, not sick. I want to be beautiful, not ugly. I want to have friends and camaraderie. I don't want to be lonely and by myself. It just goes on and on. So the more you become conscious of that layer of what's going on inside of us, the easier it is then to see that you're choosing one over the other and to change your viewpoint and go, bigger picture, right? Okay, let me get bigger than this issue. And then it changes the way you relate to it. Then you're going to be ready to go out in the world and relate from a more really genuinely loving, understanding, empathetic, and compassionate place when you deal with the outside world.
So that creates more openings for people to move towards each other rather than away from.
Yes, absolutely. Because we're very much into inclusion right now, and inclusion comes with, diversity. You can either include or exclude. So again, you've got a polarity. Now, right now, we're never supposed to exclude. Well, that's not going to work either, because there are situations where you have to exclude people based on what's needed to do the project or to get the job done. I'm not going to let a little kid truly help me put the knives away because that's dangerous for the kid, right? Or I don't particularly want somebody who's into conservatism engaged in a conversation around how can we be more liberal, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you do want that person's opinion in there. You do want the opinion in there so that you can see it, because liberal and conservative is another polarity. So you want to become bigger than that. And especially in politics today, of course, well, the whole world today is so ensconced in polarization. It's overwhelming. And so the need for changing how we're looking at it, right? Which is why I'm dealing with psychology here, because we can't really get to being a spiritual being without changing our psychology to support that. Right? You have to go through your mind if you really want to get to that place that we call spiritual, that's on the other side of the mind, whether you call it big mind or God or whatever you call it. We have to still get through all the objections of the mind, the little mind, the unconscious mind. That's kind of what my stuff is all about.
Wow. I'm just thinking about perspective. Just thinking about the perspective changing.
Yes.
From being a little ant or from being an elephant.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's such a good example, because, an ant sees so little. An elephant, has a much bigger life to live in, right, than a little ant does, at least in its awareness, right? Mm-hmm. At least we assume that. I'm assuming an elephant has awareness. I think it does. Sensitivity to things. Awesome. Yeah, so the goal here is to always become bigger than your problem. If you're in the problem and you're trying to solve it, you are really hampering yourself. The better way to solve any problem is to be bigger than the problem. You have a bigger picture, right? And I think that's part of the aim of inclusion, is to bring in all the different viewpoints that are out there so that we can create a bigger picture. But the question is, do I polarize in the presence of all that inclusion because I don't like a lot of the viewpoints that are coming in? Are they at direct odds from what I'm all about? Right.
Mm-hmm. Makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. So it's really an inside job. I think somebody, I can't remember her name, wrote that book, Happiness is an Inside Job. Equanimity is an inside job. You really have to learn the mechanics of equanimity, the neurology of equanimity, and how to get your unconscious mind on board with such an outrageous idea as letting life be what it is. What?
Without fighting it?
The ego
and
does not,
defending and, yeah, right.
it's
Yeah,
not
the
a great idea.
authenticity,
Say again?
the authenticity begins to show up. And I
Yeah,
guess that speaks back to the wisdom, because you can
yes.
have knowledge about something, but when it becomes internalized, it seems like then it's becomes wisdom of some sort.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a wisdom in this. If you look at the way awakened people, awakened mystics, saints operate, I'm saying those people who actually generate and behave with an unflappable nature, and they're undisturbed by whatever's going on around them, and yet free to act with love and compassion and empathy. If we look at that, we understand, there's something that we have to do differently than what we're doing. And it is mindfulness is the core, but there's a next step. It's where do you direct your mindfulness? Where do you place your attention? And there's more places to put it that can actually shift your psychology and thus your physiology and open your heart. Because when you get bigger, you start to see more things. And as soon as you start to see this dynamic about polar opposites, it's easier. Everything is easier because you're not fighting the fundamental fabric that human experience is wound into. It's a beautiful thing to start actually thinking that way, which you articulated in your book so well in the corporate world, the dynamics that are faced there, where you have one aspect in conflict with another aspect, and you've got to have both, and you can't get away from that in the business world, because to run a good business, you need to have these two things, like, research and development and sales, for example.
Yes.
Where do we put our money and our time, That's your domain, but I think that's where we cross here and found each other. It was with this paradox thing.
Yes, yes. I'm so delighted. If you could leave our listeners and audience with one little jewel of thought, what might you say?
Well, what I always say to people is this beautiful quote by an Indian mystic named Nisargadatta, who is no longer on the planet. And it goes like this: love tells me I am everything. Wisdom tells me I am nothing. Between these two, my life flows.
Ah, that's
I like
beautiful.
that.
I
It's,
like that too.
yeah.
I wanted people to know that, what is your website?
It's www.raginimichaels.com. That's RAGINI Michaels.com.
And to receive the free offering you have, what is that link?
That link for the free offering, which is a little PDF book called The Inner Tug of War. All you have to do is go to www.innertugofwar.com. Innertugofwar.com.
INNER.
Yes.
Custom
The
cultures
tug of
here.
war. No
Perfect,
dashes, no
perfect.
anything, just all of it together.
That is so awesome. I'm so glad to now be able to call you a friend and a colleague. And I
Absolutely.
so appreciate the wisdom of the psychology, awakened psychology that you bring to this summit. So I'm
Thank you.
grateful and thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Joanne. Much love to you. Take care.
Thank you.